Welcome to Glisso English. Real life stories.
Imagine standing in a crowded grocery store, looking at the price of a simple carton of eggs and just starting to cry. Not because of the eggs, but because everything in life has suddenly become too much. Today, we are going to follow a story called The Breaking Point. It's a 10-chapter journey about a character who hits rock bottom from modern burnout, but slowly learns how to rebuild their life, set boundaries, and find peace again. As you listen to this deeply relatable story, you're also going to learn essential English vocabulary, phrasal verbs, and idioms about stress, survival, and recovery, like the straw that broke the camel's back, and learning how to stand up for yourself. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by the cost of living or the weight of the world, this story is for you. Let's get started with Chapter 1. The fluorescent lights of the supermarket buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glare over the crowded aisles. It was 6:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the store was packed with tired people rushing to grab dinner after a long workday. Liam stood in front of the dairy case, his wire shopping cart holding nothing but a loaf of bread and a small block of cheese. He reached out to grab a carton of eggs, but stopped midair. His eyes locked on to the price tag, $7.50. Suddenly, the air felt incredibly heavy. Liam stared at the numbers, and a strange, tight sensation gripped his chest. It wasn't just about the eggs. It was the fact that he had worked 50 hours this week, yet his bank account was almost empty. It was the text message from his landlord about next month's rent increase. It was the relentless, crushing weight of trying to survive in a city that felt like it was actively pushing him out. A shopper pushed past him, murmuring a curt "excuse me," but Liam couldn't move. A warm tear slipped down his cheek, followed quickly by another. He stood there, frozen in the middle of aisle 4, silently crying under the bright grocery store lights. Every worry he had been pushing down for months finally rushed to the surface all at once. He couldn't hold it back anymore. This tiny, everyday frustration was the straw that broke the camel's back. He had officially reached his breaking point. Liam left the basket near the dairy aisle and slipped out of the store, leaving the eggs behind. The cool evening air hit his face, but it didn't do much to calm the roaring in his ears. He walked with his head down, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. The city around him was a blur of flashing traffic lights, honking horns, and rushing commuters. Usually he was hyper-aware of the busy streets, but tonight his mind completely shut down. He was physically walking, but mentally he was miles away, trapped in his own head. He managed to tune out the noise of the sirens and the chatter of people passing by on the sidewalk. His feet moved purely on autopilot, guiding him down the familiar turns toward his apartment building. Every block felt twice as long as usual, as if the sidewalk itself was pulling at his shoes. The hot tears had stopped, leaving his skin feeling tight and cold against the wind. He felt a deep sense of embarrassment burning in his chest, wondering if anyone in the store had noticed him crying. But more than embarrassed, he just felt utterly hollow, like an empty shell moving through a crowd. When he finally reached the front door of his building, his hands shook slightly as he fumbled with his keys. He pushed the heavy door open, stepped into the dim hallway, and let it click shut behind him. He had made it back to his space, but the heavy weight in his chest had followed him all the way home. Liam dropped his keys onto the small counter by the door and walked straight to the kitchen table. He sat down heavily, the old wooden chair creaking under his weight in the quiet apartment. On the table sat a neat stack of papers, bills, bank statements, and the recent notice from his landlord. He pulled the papers toward him and began to look at the numbers, forced to do a mental and financial inventory. His life had become completely unsustainable, a constant race where the finish line kept moving further away. He thought about his job at the logistics firm, where he consistently worked 50 hours a week but barely earned enough to cover the basics. The cost of everything, from utilities to a simple bag of groceries, had climbed higher and higher over the past year. It wasn't just a financial problem. It was a state of total, chronic burnout that had been quietly hollowed out his energy. For months, he had ignored the constant headaches, the sleepless nights, and the underlying sense of dread each morning. He had isolated himself, too, turning down invitations from friends because he couldn't afford dinner or simply didn't have the emotional energy to chat. Looking at the numbers on the page, the reality of his situation became entirely clear and impossible to ignore. He was completely overwhelmed, trapped in a cycle of working just to pay for a life he wasn't even getting to live. The crying spell in the grocery store wasn't a random emotional outburst. It was his body finally demanding that he pay attention. He leaned his elbows on the table, buried his face in his hands, and wondered how much longer he could keep this up. The sudden sharp buzz of Liam's phone on the wooden table made him jump. He lifted his head from his hands and looked at the glowing screen, seeing his older sister's name flash across it. He hesitated for a moment, wiping his face with the back of his hand, unsure if he could handle talking to anyone right now. He swallowed hard, cleared his throat to hide the shakiness in his voice, and swiped the screen to answer. "Hey, Liam, just calling to check in," Maya said, her voice warm and full of energy from 3 states away. Liam's natural instinct was to put up a front, to laugh and tell her that everything was going completely great. "Hey, Maya," he said, forcing a small smile that she couldn't see through the phone. "Yeah, I'm just hanging out, keeping busy." But Maya had known him his entire life, and she immediately picked up on the heavy, flat tone in his brief response. "Liam, you sound completely exhausted," she said, her voice softening instantly. "Is everything okay with you?" That simple question, asked with genuine care, threatened to bring the tears right back to the surface. He tried to think of a casual excuse, blaming it on a long day at the office or a bad night of sleep, but the words got stuck in his throat. The silence stretched out over the phone line for a few long seconds as he fought against the lump forming in his neck. Finally, he let out a long, ragged breath, giving up the exhausting effort of pretending to have it all together. "Honestly, Maya, no, I am not okay," he whispered, the raw truth finally slipping out into the quiet room. For the first time in over a year, he didn't try to hide his struggle, and saying the words out loud felt like a tiny weight lifting off his chest. The next morning, Liam woke up before his alarm, staring at the ceiling as a heavy sense of dread filled his stomach. His body felt like lead, and the thought of sitting at his desk for another 10-hour shift made his chest tighten. He picked up his phone, opened his email, and began typing a message to his supervisor, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He had always been the employee who never missed a day, always choosing to push through the fatigue no matter what. A deep wave of guilt washed over him as he wrote the words, feeling like he was failing his team by stepping away. But he remembered Maya's words from the night before, reminding him that his health had to come before his productivity. He swallowed his anxiety, took a deep breath, and finally hit send to call in sick for a mental health day. As soon as the email disappeared from his screen, a strange, quiet wave of relief washed over his entire body.
He set the phone face down on his nightstand, pulled the heavy blankets back up to his chin, and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he wasn't rushing to catch a train, gulping down burning coffee, or checking his schedule. He felt the morning sun slowly move across his bedroom floor, warming the space without asking anything from him. The world outside his window was still rushing by, but he had chosen to step off the track, even if just for 24 hours. He realized that taking a pause wasn't an act of selfishness or laziness. It was a necessary choice to survive. He was finally learning how to look out for himself, starting with the simple act of allowing his body to rest. By noon, the initial relief of staying home had faded, replaced by a strange, creeping feeling of unease. Liam walked into the living room and sat on the couch, but the absolute silence of the apartment felt heavy and unnatural. For the last 3 years, his brain had been constantly stimulated by emails, phone calls, deadlines, and city noise. Now, with nothing to do and nowhere to be, a deep sense of restlessness settled into his bones. He felt a strong urge to open his laptop, to check his work inbox, or to clean the kitchen, anything to feel useful. Weeded to a culture of constant productivity, doing absolutely nothing felt like a dangerous waste of time. He had to actively fight the irrational guilt that told him he didn't deserve to just sit still and breathe. He decided to leave his phone in the bedroom, cutting off the temptation to scroll through social media or check the news. Instead, he just sat by the window, watching the branches of a tree sway gently in the afternoon breeze. At first, his mind raced with anxious thoughts about the bills, his career, and all the things he couldn't control. But as the hours slowly ticked by, the chaotic noise in his head began to soften into a quiet hum. He wrapped himself in a warm blanket and let his muscles completely unclench, surrendering to the stillness of the room. He began to see that this quiet solitude wasn't a void to be filled with busy work. It was a space for healing. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the floor, his heart rate had finally slowed down. On Thursday evening, Liam sat at his kitchen table again, but this time he didn't feel the same paralyzing panic. The 2 days of rest had cleared the heavy fog from his brain, giving him the mental clarity he desperately needed. He grabbed a fresh pad of paper and a black pen, determined to make some hard, practical decisions about his life. He knew he couldn't change the inflation rate or the global economy, but he could change how he managed his own world. It was time to accept reality, stop chasing unrealistic expectations, and cut his losses before he burned out completely. He began by looking at his monthly expenses with a sharp, unsentimental eye, looking for things to eliminate. He canceled 3 streaming subscriptions he barely watched and called his internet provider to negotiate a cheaper basic plan. Next, he looked at his schedule and ruthlessly crossed off commitments that drained his energy without bringing him any joy. He drafted a polite email to a local committee, letting them know he had to step down from his volunteer role immediately. He realized that trying to be a perfect employee, a perfect friend, and a perfect citizen was what had broken him. By letting go of the need to please everyone else, he was freeing up the precious energy he needed just to survive. This radical trimming of his budget and his time didn't feel like a failure or a shameful step backward anymore. Instead, it felt like a deliberate, powerful act of self-preservation, a way to build a wall around his peace of mind. He closed his notebook, took a deep breath, and felt a quiet confidence that he hadn't experienced in a very long time.
Over the next few weeks, Liam began to rebuild his daily life around a completely different set of values. He realized that while he couldn't change his income overnight, he could change how he spent his free hours. Instead of focusing on all the expensive things he could no longer afford, he started looking for tiny, cost-free moments of happiness. He began waking up 20 minutes early just to sit by his kitchen window, drinking his coffee in complete silence before the day started. On Saturday mornings, he walked down to the neighborhood library, discovering the quiet pleasure of browsing rows of free books. He took long walks through a nearby city park, practicing mindfulness by focusing entirely on the crisp air and the sound of birds. He discovered that these small, intentional moments acted like a protective shield against the daily chaos of the city. Slowly, his mental resilience began to return, making him feel stronger and more grounded than he had in months. He learned that a peaceful life didn't require a massive bank account, it just required a shift in attention. He began to feel a deep sense of appreciation for the simple things he had taken for granted during his months of constant rushing. A homemade sandwich, eaten on a park bench, started to bring him more genuine satisfaction than an expensive restaurant meal ever did. The heavy, dark cloud that had been hanging over his head for the past year was finally beginning to break apart. He wasn't rich, and his problems hadn't magically disappeared, but he was finally learning how to truly live in the present moment. He was finding joy in the small gaps of a busy life, and that made all the difference in the world.
On Monday morning, Liam walked back into the logistics office, but he did not carry his old habits with him. The previous version of him would have immediately started taking on extra projects to prove his worth to the management. But after weeks of reflection, he knew he had to establish a new, sustainable baseline for his professional life. At 2 p.m., his supervisor walked over to his desk, dropping a thick stack of unassigned shipping files onto his keyboard. "Liam, I need you to log into the system and handle these updates before you head home tonight," the supervisor said casually. In the past, Liam would have nodded silently, stayed until 8 p.m., and swallowed his frustration while his dinner grew cold. Instead, he took a steady breath, looked his boss directly in the eyes, and chose to stand up for himself. "I can certainly start on these right now," Liam said, keeping his tone perfectly calm, polite, and professional. "However, my shift ends at 5 p.m., so whatever is left over will have to wait until tomorrow morning." The supervisor blinked in surprise, clearly unaccustomed to hearing boundaries from the most compliant worker in the department. For a tense second, the office was completely quiet, except for the hum of the air conditioner overhead. "All right," the supervisor finally muttered, picking up half the files. "I will pass these over to the morning team instead." As his boss walked away, Liam felt a sudden rush of adrenaline, followed by a profound sense of personal victory. He had successfully set a boundary without losing his temper, causing a scene, or feeling a wave of toxic guilt.
3 months after his breaking point, Liam walked back through the automatic doors of the same neighborhood supermarket. It was another busy Tuesday evening, and the store was filled with the familiar sounds of rolling carts and scanning registers. He walked down the bright aisles with a steady pace, holding a small basket instead of pushing a massive empty cart. He reached aisle 4 and stopped directly in front of the dairy case, looking at the exact shelf from 3 months ago. He reached out his hand, picked up a carton of large brown eggs, and looked directly at the paper price tag. The numbers had not changed at all. The price of the carton was still exactly $7.50. The economic reality of the city was just as difficult as before, and the cost of living remained high. But as Liam looked at the numbers, he didn't feel a tight sensation in his chest, and no tears came to his eyes. He smiled softly to himself, realizing that while the world around him had stayed the same, he had completely transformed. He had lowered his expenses, established firm boundaries at work, and learned to find peace in small daily moments. He placed the eggs gently into his shopping basket, knowing he could afford them because he had cut out the things that didn't matter. He felt a deep sense of closure as he realized his journey had finally come full circle, right here in aisle 4. He walked up to the checkout counter, paid for his food, and stepped out into the cool evening air with his head held high. He was no longer a victim of his circumstances. He was a man who had broken down, rebuilt, and reclaimed his life. And that brings us to the end of Liam's journey. Liam's story shows us that hitting a breaking point isn't the end of the road. Sometimes it's the exact moment we need to stop, reevaluate, and completely change our lives for the better. The world didn't change for Liam, but he changed how he interacted with the world. I want to hear from you now. Have you ever experienced a moment where a tiny thing felt like the last straw? How did you handle it? Leave a comment down below and share your thoughts. It's a great way to practice your English writing. You can find all the vocabulary of the story down below in the description box. If you enjoyed this story and want to keep improving your English listening skills with real-life dilemmas, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next story. Goodbye.